Hello, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. Sorry this is a week late. Life has honestly been a level of insanity I was not expecting, and I just haven't had the time to do my usual study sessions throughout the past 2 weeks. Equal parts my day job, wedding planning, potentially moving states, and going just a little bit too hard on my hen's night. I mean it when I say I promise never to drink that much again. But before I go too far, if you haven't already, go and poke the 5-star review button, but blame someone else when it asks why. Now, we do love here, and today I have a love story for you. Isn't that nice? It isn't a good love story, and it's quite horrifying really, but let's be honest, this is exactly why you are here, you absolute weirdo. Love you. This is what you should know about David and Catherine Burney. David John Burney was born on the 16th of February 1951 and was the eldest of 5 children. Sadly, David wasn't born into a happy and loving family that even really wanted children. To put that into proper perspective, when his parents had asked their priest to conduct their wedding, he voiced concerns about them as individuals and as a potential couple, namely broadly stating that he felt that their union could never lead to anything good, and he was right. The couple were an unusual and unsuited pairing. The father was a short and unattractive man, while the mother was known for being a complete bogan. And for those who don't know the Aussie lingo, that means she had a coarse manner, used a lot of profanities and bad behaviour. She was also known for exchanging sexual favours with taxi drivers as payment for her fares. Classy. Growing up, there were rumours throughout the school and church that the Burneys attended due to their dysfunctional behaviour. Call me Milan because I am about to pour the tea. The rumours surrounded the family's promiscuity, alcoholism, and that they engaged in incest. And that was not always engaged in willingly either. Which honestly just makes my stomach turn. My personal opinion is that you should really not be engaging in sexual activity with any of your family. But on top of these rumours was what David's friends experienced, commenting on the family's home, claiming that it was unkept and filthy, with the family never having regular meals together, nor were meals prepared for the children by their parents. And when I say that, I mean, to put it bluntly, the fridge would remain open. Food would obviously go bad, but the mother literally did nothing to care for her children, and the father was either always at work or drunk. It was in the early 1960s that David's parents decided to move the family to another Perth suburb, where David had met Catherine through mutual friends. And yes, that Catherine. And her life had a similarly brutal start like David's. Catherine Margaret Harrison, the future Catherine Burney, was born on the 23rd of May 1951. At the age of 2 years old, her mother died while giving birth. Both mother and child tragically died. What makes this so much sadder is that her father decided that it was too hard to raise his daughter and left her with her grandparents. Because what pairs better with trauma than abandonment of a man who is supposed to love you no matter what? But it's not okay because it does get worse. Because when Catherine hit the age of 10, her father then petitioned the courts to gain custody again, and won. But he wouldn't just take her back in and they would live happily ever after. No. It was always back and forth, push and pull, because he would want her, and then, when he would have her, he would abandon her again and again. He is a shitty sperm donor. Personal opinion, if you aren't going to be in your kid's life, maybe just stay out rather than jumping in and out, because that shit hurts. But when they were both 12 years old, worlds would collide as they met for the first time. In my personal and uneducated opinion, because I am not a psychologist, but I have read a handful of books and been to quite a bit of therapy in my life. Being so young and from dysfunctional families, I theorize that they would have bonded over the shared trauma of not being wanted by their own families. As these two bonded, it would have been during one of these stints where Catherine's father decided he wanted her again, and expressed that he felt David was a bad influence. Now, he wasn't wrong, but he wasn't a real father to her. So between her not feeling connected to him in a parent-child capacity and typical childhood rebellion, when her father tried to put his foot down regarding the friendship, Catherine disobeyed. This would lead the two of them getting into trouble with authorities at a young age for mischief they would get into. This would include charges for breaking and entering, trespassing, unlawfully driving a motor vehicle, and theft. At the age of 15, David dropped out of school to become an apprentice jockey for Eric Parnham at the nearby Ascot Racecourse. While he worked there, he would physically harm the horses and developed a taste for exhibitionism. First of all, I hate people who hurt animals. It's disgusting. And as for the exhibitionism, I'm not here to yuck someone's yum, but if it's a kink, you really should have enthusiastic consent from all involved. And unlike David, you should just not be riding by your workplace on your bicycle naked. Not okay. But he was never a fan of consent. This wouldn't be all, because with these two, it really does only ever get worse. One night, David decided everything he had been doing was just too vanilla. So he broke into the room of an elderly lady where he was boarding, wearing absolutely nothing aside from stockings over his head, and attempted to commit his first rape. At this point, we are still on the shallow end of everything, but I feel it would be just nice to remind everyone at this point that this scumbag is dead. So when it gets too much, remember he can't do anything to anyone anymore, because he is literal worm food. If it also helps, it was around this time that the community had made up their minds on their opinion of David, that he was a sex and porn addict. And honestly, I believe that this is the polite and edited version of what they thought. It was sometime after these two were caught for theft and sentenced to a short prison term. During this time, Catherine took the time to reevaluate her life choices, which is honestly fantastic because it's essentially what those who are in prison are supposed to do. She decided that she needed to get away from David and start over fresh. This was made easier by the fact that David had a longer sentence and that she was let out on probation. Taking full advantage of the help around her, she was able to find herself a job as a housekeeper, working for the McLaughlin family, where she eventually ended up marrying the eldest son, Donald, by her 21st birthday. The couple would go on to have 7 children. However, this part is honestly very sad. One child, who was only an infant, was crawling around the driveway unattended, which I personally just don't get. But while this child was crawling around the driveway, he was run over by a car and died. This likely happened because Catherine was never really interested in being a parent. This likely happened because Catherine was never really interested in being a parent, which I imagine would have been a form of learned behavior at this point in her life. Now, while this was all happening, and Catherine appeared to be moving on with her life, David attempted to move on with his. Somehow, while being known as a sex and pornography addict and a paraphiliac, he managed to find a wife. Now, if you're like me and you heard the word paraphiliac and are wondering what the heck that meant, I will quickly break that down for you. Paraphilia is the experience of intense sexual arousal to atypical objects, fetishes, situations, fantasies, behaviors, or individuals. This can be arousal from non-human objects, the suffering or humiliation of oneself or one's partner, children, and non-consenting persons. Again, I'm not here to yuck people's yum most of the time, but legal age and enthusiastic consent is very important. Okay? Glad we had this talk. But I digress. David married his first wife during his 20s, and they had a little girl named Tanya. Neither this marriage, nor the one Catherine had to Donald, would last, and in 1985, Catherine and David Birney would rekindle their relationship. Now, I couldn't find too much on why David was on prison again, as looking them up only really brings up the information on their major joint crimes, but I can tell you that he was in prison when they started talking again. During this time, David decided he no longer wanted to be in prison and wanted to be with Catherine, so he escaped to be with her. And what did Catherine do when David showed back up in her life again? She abandoned her whole family, of course. They moved into a white brick 2-bedroom bungalow on Morehouse Street with him. This house was filthy, looked abandoned, and desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. The couple did not marry, ever. However, Catherine did change her last name to Bernie through the deed poll. Now, to investigate the psychology of the couple, I did speak with a psychotherapy student and fantastic friend, Colleen. To lay down the groundwork, I will start off by explaining attachment theory in an abridged format. That being said, there is tons of information online if you are interested in learning more, and I will include some links in the show notes. Now, attachment theory is about human relationships. The bond between child and their caregiver is at the heart of a healthy child development and lays a foundation for how we relate to others throughout our lives. In other words, how your parents or caregivers acted around you and brought you up will impact who you are as a person. So you as a child would have been born with set behaviors such as crying, gazing, smiling, and calling out to help form a bond with your primary caregiver. And that behavior would trigger a reaction from said caregiver. In an ideal healthy setting, it would look like a child crying and the caregiver consoling and calming them, giving that child the reassurance that they are safe. That would then be internalized and influence how they see themselves, others, and the world. There are 4 different types of attachment style: secure, insecure ambivalent, insecure avoidant, and disorganized. That being said, a person's behavior rarely fits neatly into one specific attachment style and may show a mixture of styles. Now with that explained, I asked Colleen what attachment style she theorized that the Bernies would have, and to be perfectly honest, I believe she hit the nail on the head. David Bernie would likely have disorganized attachment. Now this attachment style is described as when caregivers are frightening or dangerous. David would have been afraid to approach them because he likely wouldn't have been able to predict their response. So if we assume he did approach one of his parents, he would have either been outright ignored, attacked, or, regarding certain rumors, sexually and physically abused. As a result, he wouldn't be able to organize his behavior and would have difficulty regulating his emotions. People with this attachment style typically see other people as not to be trusted. But then we also take into consideration his household growing up. With parents like this, there would have been no regulation or boundaries being enforced. It is likely, my dear listener, that if you are a parent or have helped care for a child, you have likely had to help enforce these boundaries by telling a child not to jump on the bed or to be gentle when patting the household pet. This would have been entirely vacant from his life and would have then also been responsible for raising his 4 younger siblings. So this would be the long way of saying he had no tools to regulate his emotions or impulses. Because of this impacted by neglect and abuse, it would have contributed to his actions. Now that being said, having a traumatic childhood or a mental illness does not make you a bad person. It is a choice that you make, and this crusty old sock chose to be bad. As the question should always remain, was it an irresistible impulse or an impulse unresisted? As for Catherine, the theory is that she would have had an insecure, ambivalent attachment style. This attachment style develops when the carer is unreliable, inconsistent, intrusive, blaming, or preoccupied with other things and is emotionally neglectful. Catherine would have likely exaggerated her feelings to try and gain a response from her father. The response may have been inappropriate, haphazard, or not forthcoming, such as fighting tooth and nail for her, only to then abandon her again in a repeating cycle. Those with this attachment style may reflect their simultaneous need for, yet anger with their caregiver. So with this, Catherine would have also been looking for acceptance and to feel wanted, but this would have also been clouded by the fear of rejection and feeling as though she needed to, at least on a subconscious level, gain the love and approval from someone who would represent her father. In this horrendous situation, it would have been David Bernie, and she would bend to his wants to keep him happy and to keep him with her. Unfortunately, I have been unsuccessful in finding anything regarding a psychological evaluation, but there is a lot more to these 2 demons that would have made them kill. But at least with somewhat understanding of their attachment style, we can understand their baseline behavior. But thank you for staying with me on that. Back to the actual timeline with a warning that this is going to get gross and potentially a bit triggering. So strap in. While living together, Catherine was completely dependent on David, both emotionally and physically. Sadly, this left her completely vulnerable to being controlled and manipulated. And as I said, she would do anything to keep him happy. David was very demanding when it came to sex, allegedly said to have sex up to 6 times a day. And this is while he was working full-time in a scrapyard. I just want to know where he got the energy. During 1986, David's younger brother, James Burney, was released from prison and stayed with the couple. James recently had been released from prison for sexual assault and would later go on to explain that David would use numbing spray on his penis before sex to ensure it lasted longer. And this would be with more than just Catherine. She appeared to consent to a somewhat open relationship to keep David happy. This would include David offering Catherine up to his brother James, effectively as a sex toy. And allegedly at one point or another, while Catherine was away and he was struggling to get laid, he coerced his brother into having sex with him. Again, don't be having sex with your family, please. Specifically not your siblings. However, this would only last so long, as they would eventually feel as though they had exhausted all of their sexual options and started to explore new ways to indulge in pleasure. This opened a scary line of conversation where David expressed his desire to abduct and rape women. Allegedly, Catherine initially believed that this was all fantasy and dirty talk, but would find out in a few weeks how wrong she was. Mary Nilsson was the first victim of the Burneys. She was a beautiful 22-year-old girl who was studying psychology and working part-time in a delicatessen. She met David at the spare parts yard where he worked while looking for new tires for her car. Being a young adult with little money to her name, as is still tradition for many students, David offered to sell her some tires for cheap, but told her he couldn't do it at the yard as it would put him at risk of losing his job. Mary believed he was just being sweet and trying to help a young lady out, and accepted. He gave her his phone number and told her to call when she felt ready, making it sound like he didn't want to put any pressure on her. On the 6th of October, 1986, she went to the Burneys' house. This poor, sweet woman had no idea what was coming for her, but when the door was opened for her, she was gagged, chained to a bed, and raped by David while Catherine watched. She was taken to the Gleneagles National Park near Albany Highway in Bedfordale. Mary begged for her life, but instead was raped again and strangled with a nylon cord. Strangulation is not like the movies, nor is it as quick as it seems in articles where they state that she dropped dead at David's feet. No, this would have roughly taken 5 minutes of continuous pressure, and she would have passed out first, so he would have had to have kept going. Not that it mattered to him in the end, as he then stabbed through her body, believing it would speed up the decomposition, as he had read that somewhere in a book. Seriously, what a fucking tosser. They buried Mary in a shallow grave and left her to rot. Mary would have received her degree for psychology from the University of Western Australia in the following year. David would later claim that this murder was unplanned, but to me, the nylon rope and presence of a knife determines that he is a lying sack of shit. Horrifyingly, the second killing would take place just 2 weeks later on the 20th of October. Susanna Candy was a bright and charming 15-year-old girl. She was an outstanding student at Hollywood Senior High School and lived at home in Nedlands with her parents, 2 brothers and sister. Catherine had been driving around for hours, trolling for their next victim, when they saw bright and young Susanna walking home from school along the Stirling Highway. When the Burneys pulled up alongside her, she must have felt somewhat safe seeing a woman in the car, but tragically, this would not be the case because as soon as she got into the car, David pulled a knife and held it to her throat. Once at the Burneys' house, Susanna was forced to write letters to her family to assure them that she was alright and had decided to run away. But the family feared for her life as this was completely out of character. David repeatedly raped Susanna, who was bound and gagged, and this would have gone on for hours. Once David was finished raping Susanna, Catherine got into bed with them, knowing this would turn him on. Once they had finished having consensual sex, Catherine attempted to strangle Susanna with the nylon cord, but she fought back viciously. So much so that the Bernies had to force sleeping pills down her throat to calm her down. But seriously, they must have been so weak, being unable to defend themselves against a small teenager. I'm just sad that Susanna didn't get to finish kicking the snot out of them. Once Susanna was asleep, David put the cord around her neck and told Catherine to prove her undying love for him by murdering her. Catherine, who was so codependent and needy, obliged willingly. She tightened the cord slowly around Susanna's neck until she stopped breathing. All the while, David stood beside the bed, watching. After being apprehended by the police, Catherine was asked why she had done it, and she was quoted as saying, "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within my inner self. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied. She was a female, and females hurt and destroy males." It's a shame she didn't feel so strongly about herself or even her children. Honestly, I feel that therapy could have helped her, but sadly for all the victims and her children, she chose wrong. Sadder still is she has still never shown any remorse for what she has done. The Bernies then took Susanna to the state park where they had buried her in a shallow grave. Again, the next attack would be less than 2 weeks later. On the 1st of November, the Bernies saw 31-year-old Norleen Patterson. Norleen was standing beside her car that had run out of fuel on the Canning Highway. Norleen had been on her way home from her job as bar manager at the Nedlands Golf Club, really just minding her own business and trying to make a living, when these monsters pulled up alongside her. David offered his help to Norleen, and with it being the 80s and her not having much else choice to get home, she accepted and got into the car with them. Norleen would regret this immediately, as once she sat down and put on her seatbelt, a knife was put to her throat and she was taken to their place on Morehouse Street, where the Bernies lived. I honestly can't imagine how she must have felt, or any of the victims for that. But once Norleen was taken into the house, she was promptly bound and gagged before being repeatedly raped by David. The plan for Norleen was the same as it was for Mary Nilsson and Susanna Candy. Rape her often and kill her within the same night. However, Catherine noticed that David seemed to be fond of Norleen and became increasingly jealous, upset, and insecure. And honestly, you can't compare the pair. Norleen was beautiful and vivacious, and Catherine, well, she has a hard and unlovable face, ugly inside and out. It was even said that Norleen represented the kind of woman Catherine wished she could be, which caused her to hate her even more. After a longer period of time than planned, Catherine, who had reached her limit of this after 3 nights, gave David an ultimatum. She grabbed a kitchen knife and put it to her chest and told him, "You either kill her tonight or I kill myself." Ultimatums are a toxic act, and this is already a very obviously toxic and codependent relationship. What Catherine did was a desperate bid for control, to which David complied. Norleen was force-fed sleeping pills and then strangled to death before being taken to a park and buried beside Mary and Susanna. This time between Norleen and the next victim was barely days, as on the 5th of November, they came across 21-year-old Denise Brown. Denise was waiting for a bus on Sterling Highway. As is their pattern, they pulled up alongside her and offered her a ride for where she needed to go. Once in the car, Catherine would utter the code word that they had been using. "I have the munchies, how about you?" And then a knife would be pulled on Denise, and she would be taken to their house, where she was bound, gagged, and raped. Denise was taken by car to the Pine Plantation, where she was raped again while David waited for the sun to set and the blanket of darkness to settle. Once night had fallen, David raped her again, this time stabbing her in the neck. Believing Denise was dead, he began to bury her in a shallow grave, but they were both surprised when Denise sat bolt upright in her grave. Panicked, David struck Denise in the head with an axe, and Catherine just watched on in shock and amazement. It's alleged here that Catherine was so concerned about how messy things were starting to get that they were likely to get caught. It really is a shame she didn't feel that way after the first attack, but I theorize that due to her being so insecure, she managed to justify all of these actions to herself. Again, she has shown no remorse and deserves no sympathy at all. Just 5 days later, the Bernies would find their fifth confirmed and final victim, Kate Moyer. Kate was on her way home after a night out with friends when she was abducted by the Bernies. Frightened, Kate asked them if they intended to kill or rape her, and David replied by saying, "We'll only rape you if you're good." Once at their home on Morehouse Street, Kate was forced to ring her mother, where she was forced to assure her that she had drunk too much and was staying at a friend's house. This was in hope that her mother would ring her friend, as she was not a drinker. Once this was done, Kate was quizzed on who she was and was made to take a shower, smoke cannabis, and sit down to watch movies with them. During this time, Kate was also forced to dance to the Dire Straits song Romeo and Juliet in front of the Bernies. David raped her the first time just after midnight, while Catherine watched and took notes. Sometime after, Kate was given a pen and paper to write goodbye letters to her loved ones and was then made to shower again and moved into the master bedroom where she was raped again. David cuffed her foot to his and gave her some pills to take. She was told to go to sleep. Now, Kate was not a stupid girl at all. She hid the pills under her tongue and later put them under the mattress. This was because she believed that if she went to sleep, she wouldn't get the chance to wake up again. On the following Monday, David, who was regarded well at his workplace, left the house to start his work week at the spare parts shop. Kate felt faintly hopeful, and she began to plan her escape and how to put enough evidence in place so she would be taken seriously and that these dangerous people would be taken off the streets. Kate first hid her lipstick and a piece of paper with her phone number in the room where she was. Her chains were briefly unshackled, giving her the freedom of movement she desperately needed to act on her plans. Luck was on Kate's side as someone knocked on the front door and Catherine went to answer it, leaving her unattended. Kate took her chance and broke the lock on one of the bedroom windows and pushed it open and climbed out, falling onto the driveway, where she got up and ran to the nearest house. Kate tried to gain attention at 3 houses, but no one was home. Scared and desperate, wearing only black leggings and a singlet, she found a shop with a man standing outside of it. Hysterical and shaking, she pleaded with him, saying, "Help, I've been raped. Please take me inside and call the police. If a woman comes here and says I've had a fight with her and that I'm her daughter, don't believe her. I've been raped." Immediately acting, the Good Samaritan took her directly to the police station. The police were initially skeptical of her story about the sex-crazed people abducting her at knife point and almost completely dismissed it as fabrication for attention. This sort of skepticism is exactly why it's so hard for people to come forward when they have been assaulted. And I am sad to say, but it still isn't much better. Thankfully, 22-year-old Constable Laura Hancock believed her from the beginning, due to the amount of detail she provided, including their address and telephone number. While the Bernies had given themselves aliases, Kate had read David's name on a medicine bottle. She was also able to provide other details, including that they had watched Rocky on VHS and described a drawing she had concealed in the house of proof of her presence. When the police arrived at the Bernies, no one was home. Catherine had gone out to look for their latest victim, terrified that David would blame her for not having resecured the girl's chains. Police arrested Catherine when she returned and took David from the spare parts shop in custody. While being interrogated separately, Catherine admitted to knowing Kate, but swore that she was a willing participant and all the sexual activity was consensual, which it definitely was not. The police entered and searched the Bernies' home and found Kate's picture, her bag, a packet of cigarettes she had managed to hide in the ceiling, as well as a copy of Rocky in the couple's VCR. The evidence was piling up, and thankfully, The final nail in the coffin was how stupid David was. What did it was a turn of phrase being taken literally. Now, I am sure we have all done that at least once. More likely when we were children, and that we all still cringe over it. But oh boy, this one is a doozy. One detective who just really wanted to go home said to David, "It's getting dark. Why don't you just show me where the bodies are, so we can dig them up?" The statement was said meaning, why don't you just tell me the truth? I want to go home. But to the surprise of the detective, David replied, "Okay, there is 4 of them." Assuming that the detective had already somehow figured out that he had killed multiple women. In a separate interview room, Catherine was told of David's confession, and she finally broke her silence and agreed to accompany them in revealing where they had buried Mary Nilsson, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, and Denise Brown. 3 of the victims had been buried in Gleneagle State Forest, and one of them in the Pine Plantation. David led them to the bodies of Mary, Susanna, and Denise. During this time, neither of the Bernies showed any remorse or emotion. That was until Catherine insisted on showing the police where Nolene was buried. This time, Catherine did show emotion, but it was not remorse. It was anger, and she then spat on Nolene's grave and vocalized how much she despised the deceased. Her apparent insecurity really showing itself in that moment. Catherine would later admit to not really caring about participating in the rapes and murders until they got to Denise Brown, where the brutal and messy manner of her murder seemed to have some impact on her, and was quoted as saying, "I think I must have come to a decision that sooner or later there had to be an end to the rampage. I had reached the stage when I didn't know what to do. I suppose I came to a decision that I was prepared to give her a chance." This drew out conclusions that Catherine had allowed Kate to escape by not being more careful with her, and ultimately would be confirmed by Catherine, who said, "I knew that it was foregone that David would kill her, and probably do it that night. I was just fed up with the killings. I thought if something did not happen soon, it would simply go on and never end." Now, before anyone thinks that this shows any sign of good in her, remember that this was still a self-serving choice. At trial, it was brought to light that Catherine would take videos and photos of these heinous acts, where you could hear Catherine cheering on David as they would continue to assault these young women. On the day of their sentence, a crowd gathered outside the court, and when they saw the Bernies being led in, they would scream, "Hang the bastards." The community was so outraged by the killings that they wanted to ensure that Catherine and David would receive the maximum penalty, but furthermore also wanted the death penalty reinstated for this specific case. Both Catherine and David Bernie pleaded guilty to all charges, and Justice Alkin Wallace was quoted as saying, "Each of these horrible crimes were premeditated, planned, and carried out cruelly and relentlessly over a comparatively short period. He should never be let out of prison," before stamping David's record as never to be released, under the sentence of 4 life sentences for his crimes. Catherine Bernie received the same sentence but was given a minimum term that would shockingly make her eligible for parole in 2007. However, this wasn't done haphazardly, as Justice Wallace delivered a message to her and is quoted as saying, "You willingly joined in the selection of your unfortunate victims, carried them off at knife point, and held them in captivity for the sole purpose of sexual gratification of your partner in crime, and then murdered them, lest you be identified, and then finally mutilated them. You personally extinguished the life of 2 of your victims and certainly participated in the death of the 3rd. The only appropriate punishment is the sentence I intend to impose: strict life security in prison." Once the sentencing was over, Catherine Bernie was dragged screaming and kicking and spitting to the van that would take her to the Bandyup prison. And David, ever the creep that he is, caused members of the public to scream in rage as he smiled and blew them a kiss. I can't say I blame those who screamed. I honestly would have run the risk of being detained to punch that slimy smug face. While in prison, David's violent nature remained uncurbed, as he was often engaged in fights, got beaten up, and spent much of his time in the prison infirmary. On the other side, Catherine claimed that in her first year of incarceration that she missed David and blamed herself for their capture, even telling one visitor, "I could have stopped that girl. I should have, but it all had to come to an end." Shut up, Catherine. She even allegedly told one visitor, "If I get out when I'm 55, we might get together, but we'll be too old to do anything. Once more with feeling and feel free to join in." Shut up, Catherine. In 1990, David claimed that being apart from Catherine was sending him into a complete physical and mental breakdown. There is no violin small enough to play for his so-called distress. He obviously never considered the same distress that he caused for the families of Mary, Susanna, Nolene, and Denise, let alone the distress he caused for Kate. But he wouldn't serve his full life. No, this coward would kill himself. Was it a guilty conscience? No, but it really highlights his own weak codependence. You see, initially while in jail, the Bernies wanted to marry, but by 1997, Catherine had appeared to change her mind and the letters from her to David dried up. Catherine had started to work on her campaign for parole and decided she stood a better chance by cutting him off. And to really help with this idea, no matter how half-baked it was, she told detectives she only participated because of her infatuation with David, and she took part in sexual assaults on the victims to demonstrate her love for him. My sweet listeners, if you want to do anything to please someone you're with, try writing them a love letter. Maybe wear something sexy for them. Just don't do anything illegal, okay? Glad we had this conversation. After a period, David became depressed as his letters to Catherine went unanswered and was prescribed antidepressants in prison. This would help with his depression, but not have the side effect of a decreased libido, as he would go on to sexually assault other inmates. And in 2005, his computer was confiscated after it was found to contain pornographic images. I honestly had no idea that prisoners were allowed to have computers, let alone personal computers. But hey, the more you know. It was in early October 2005 that an error resulted in the paperwork for David's antidepressants becoming lost in the system, and his supply was cut off. On the morning of October 7, 2005, prison officers entering cell 12A in the protective custody unit of Casuarina Prison found the body of 54-year-old David Birney. He had hanged himself with a sheet from the air vent. No one claimed his body, and he was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Kate Moyer carried on with her life after escaping and refused to stay a victim. Now a married woman and a mother of 3, she has stood up for herself and victims like her and has been quoted as saying, "I want to see no parole for willful murder. I want a reintroduction of willful murder as a charge. I want to see truth in sentencing. I want no parole for sex offenders and child sex offenders. We've been softening our justice system for years." Catherine finished serving her minimum 20-year non-parole term in 2000. Since then, once every 3 years, Kate is notified that Catherine's sentence is being reviewed. She claimed that she managed to get over her ordeal in about a year, but now every 3 years, that nightmare is dredged from the depths of her memory. Understandably, this cycle causes her so much anger and grief. So she has been working hard at petitioning the Attorney General to review and reform the frequency of parole hearings. This has also brought pain to the family of Catherine, who unanimously agree that she should never be released. This has been echoed loudest by her youngest son, Peter. And it was with this that Kate Moyer found an unlikely ally in Peter, in her fighting to change Australia's parole laws to stop killers like Catherine from ever being released. Peter, who was only 6 months old when his mother abandoned him, has come forward and opened up about the experience of his life as the son of a serial killer. Peter was emotionally destroyed by the actions of his mother and has explained that how being the son of Catherine has led him to being physically assaulted due to his unfortunate relation. It is between this and the fact that he could see right through her manipulations to get close to any of her kids that he wanted the death penalty for her, being quoted as saying, "I reckon it's an eye for an eye. Anyone who takes someone's life should not be allowed to live themselves." And when asked about how he would react if his mother was to be executed, he advised that he would party for a week. especially as it would be the next 30 years of stress off of his shoulders. And if you don't feel sold on how Peter feels, well, he was asked what he'd say to his mother if he was to talk to her at least one last time. He said he would tell her to hurry up and die, quickly. And on that cheerful note, that is all I have for you this episode. I will be posting relevant pictures to the case on Facebook and Instagram at What You Should Know Australia. If you want to reach out, you can do so by contacting me there or shooting me an email at whiskapod@gmail.com. That is wyskapod@gmail.com. If you haven't already, go and poke the 5-star review button, but blame someone else when it asks. Until next time, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!